what we're really all driving at, it's not necessarily conservative values or anything like that. It's truth. For things to be successful, they have to be grounded in truth. And those that are not grounded in truth, it's like denying gravity and walking off the ledge. It's only a matter of time before they hit the ground. Once you accept that you were lied to about one thing, it forces you to question everything else. Realizing you've been kind of sheltered from this thing, that you've been trusting these institutions and that they're not actually worthy of trust, the question becomes, okay, where do I put my trust?
Welcome to the Staying Free podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Meta Prime. Meta is a content creator and advocate for building alternative systems that are healthy, positive, and grounded in objective truth. The Meta Prime project seeks to provide player characters with guidance, insight, and a common language for success on their journey. So I wish I could tell you guys where I first came across Meta Prime. I actually thought that I knew where I'd heard about Meta, and then when we started this conversation, as you'll hear in a minute, I had to do a second intro because my first intro was for someone completely different. But in any case, it really did serve as a synchronicity because somehow in this mix-up, I ended up reading through some of Meta Prime's work on his Substack, which I'll put in the show notes. And the ideas that he was sharing really resonated with me, and I think will resonate with you guys as well. And what I really like about Meta is that he's not just commentating on the way the world is, he's sharing a lot of practical ideas about how we move forward and trying to build towards a positive future. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this conversation as much as I did. If so, make sure you like and share the episode on social media, and be sure to send it to a friend or someone you feel will get value from it. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, make sure you give it a 5-star rating in whichever podcast app you're using. If you're new here, welcome. Make sure you give the pod a subscribe for future episodes, and don't forget to check out some of the previous episodes as well. Finally, if you've not already done so, be sure to check out the Fountain app. I always encourage my listeners to listen on the Fountain app because it does help to support me by streaming sats, and you can also leave a boost there, which I'll always read out on the show. So I got a couple of boosts on my last episode with Hoshin. The first one is from Piers with his trademark 420 sats with the message, "Thank you, gentlemen." Thank you, Piers. And another one here, I think this is a new booster from Fernando Dorabiero with the message, "Good music." I'm really glad you like it, Fernando. I've been using this music since the very beginning, and a couple of times I have thought of changing it, but it kind of has become a bit of a trademark of the show at this point. So if you want to go and listen to the full track, by the way, that's called Organic Bijou by Ui. And I have no idea if I pronounced the song title or the artist correctly there, but I'll make sure I put that in the show notes for you, Fernando. And the final boost here is from White Wolf, who I think is another new booster. And this one is on my conversation with John Vallis, which is episode 69, with the message, "John has a way to explain and frame things in a beautiful and powerful way." And the quote here is, "The truth is always the things that set you free." Totally agree with that, White Wolf. John really does have a real way with words. And he really did bring his A game to that episode as well, which I'm obviously very grateful for. All right, that's enough of the intro. On to the episode with Meta Prime. All right, Meta Prime, welcome to the Staying Free podcast. Welcome again. We just starting this for the second time because I ruined the first intro. But just wanting to give my audience a little bit of a primer as to yourself. And I thought a good way to do this actually was I ran one of your articles from Substack through ChatGPT and was like, can you give me the essence of this person? And I figure that might be a good starting point to kind of launch off from. So I ran the article through and it said, the Meta Prime project is about rejecting mainstream society, which he believes is corrupt and misleading, and instead pursuing a life rooted in truth and positive energy. The project aims to guide those who have realized this corruption, but don't know how to move forward. It provides strategies for self-improvement, spiritual understanding, and living a meaningful life outside of mainstream systems. The author being Meta Prime, shares his personal journey of awakening and offers a framework for others to join a parallel movement that focuses on building a better future. Do you think that's a good description of the kind of thing that you're trying to work towards?
That's actually the perfect description for what I'm trying to work towards. Yeah. Very succinct, very, very on point.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which article I fed into it. I think this one was just called Welcome to the Meta Prime Project. I think it was one of the ones that you did before. I know you sent me another one more recently, and I will try and make a effort to put that in the show notes, although I always forget. But yeah, I guess why don't you give a bit more depth to that then, in terms of like who you are, what your background is, like what. Yeah, just start from the beginning. Kind of like your coming of age moment, so to speak, in terms of like how you've ingrained yourself in this truth movement.
Yeah. No, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and I think one of the points that you made that resonated with me is part of the reason that you got started was to kind of find other people you could have conversations with, and have those connections that kind of confirmed your sanity, right? Because we sit in this situation where we look out at the world around us and we're like, wow, there's so much that we're told is true that we kind of know inherently just by basic observation isn't. And we see people going along with it. And even if we try to have conversations with people, they'll push back and they'll say, oh, you're crazy. And so you kind of have two options for how things are. Either you are crazy and you have this weird kind of deluded worldview, or other people around you are just completely immersed in this delusion. And neither scenario is a very exciting scenario, right? Like you're either around a bunch of zombies or you're actually, completely deranged. I mean, it's a little bit of both when you go through all this experience, but I think finding other people and kind of aligning yourself towards what is good and productive and healthy is really important. My own awakening experience, it was around 2016, was not easy. I burned a lot of friendships. I kind of, I lost a lot of sanity, and when I got on Twitter, I think it was like, end of 2020, it was beginning of 2021, right around the pandemic. One of the things I quickly noticed was there wasn't a lot of kind of like best practice guides for people who were going through this experience. And I saw a lot of people who were angry at the system. They wanted to burn it down. And, and I understand that, right? Like I went through that same experience myself. But to me, you have to be practical and realistic about what action can be taken, what can be done. And so to that end, I started writing a lot of content. It started with this 5-part process I call the journey. And it's basically how someone can break from what I call the mainstream delusion and join the parallel movement. And I see that as the ultimate goal, is building alternative systems that are healthy, that are positive, that are grounded in this kind of natural objective truth. And the beginning of that journey is kind of awakening, building a new framework, a new way of understanding things, focusing initially on self-improvement, right? You can't change how crazy the world is, so you make yourself stronger so you can react to that. And networking, going and finding other people that you can build these relationships with, and then going and starting projects. And since then, my content's been growing. It's been great. I've been meeting a lot of different people across the United States who are all working on, really interesting projects. You have intentional community projects. You have, guys who are building, networks and tech applications and educational systems, or they're promoting more local organic farming, right? There's a lot of people who are engaged in some sort of parallel movement. They might not define it as such, but I think we're all kind of reaching those similar conclusions that sitting around complaining on the internet isn't sufficient to enact change. And so that is the focus of my content. How can people move forward in a healthy way and be part of a productive way to change things for the better?
Right. Okay. You mentioned that it was kind of in 2016. What was that pivotal event for you?
Yeah, I mean the joke, right, is the Bernie Road to Trump pipeline is a real thing. So yeah, I'm a millennial. Mid to late 30s now. I grew up in a time where I was listening to a lot of like punk rock and stuff like that. It was like anti-Iraq war was kind of the degree to which I knew anything about politics. And so, I grew up, East Coast liberal family. And so, it wasn't until 2016 that I really started to pay attention to things. And initially I was kind of like, we're a wealthy country. We should be able to help people out. Like, I don't like war. That was kind of my stance. And then paying attention to that whole political campaign, all the campaigns that were run pre-election, like that really woke me up to how much the mainstream media lies, right? And because there was a weird time where the media would just blatantly lie about things like they always had, but we had the internet. And so for me specifically, there was this one moment where the media clipped this video that showed this Bernie Sanders supporter like picking up a chair. And then they used that to say, oh, Bernie needs to disavow the violence of his supporters. And then the full clip circulated online and the guy puts the chair down. And to me, that was like, okay, that isn't like a spin or an opinion or something like that. That is like blatant editing for, to manufacture a hit piece. So that was kind of the one moment that happened. And then I went down that rabbit hole and, I started kind of listening more broadly to the other side of the argument as well. And and so that was like that journey. And that was really tough because, you're like realizing you've been kind of sheltered from this thing, that you've been trusting these institutions and that they're not actually worthy of trust. The question becomes, okay, where do I put my trust? Like, what do I believe and who do I see it as authority? And I think that's a really difficult journey, especially if you are someone who's kind of embedded in a network of people who are very inclined to trust the mainstream media, because you have to make that journey largely on your own. And then you look into the internet, and the internet, the rabbit hole that exists on the internet is as deep as you want to you want to go, right? And it's not necessarily going to tell you, what the healthy, positive way forward is. And, going through that whole experience, I've kind of realized like, you can get down to the bottom of the rabbit hole. That's not going to inform you on how best to lead a good life, right? Like really, you come out of that whole experience and you realize, I have to have a good career and I should have good relationships with my family and my community. And I should build things that are practical in the world around me. Like whether or not alien people run the government or whatever it is, it's kind of irrelevant. It can be interesting stuff to talk about, but it really needs to be understood as like conspiratainment more or less. And, if we do want to enact and create a better, future for ourselves and for our children, then focusing on these practical things, I think is it's important to kind of highlight that and kind of hope people move in that direction, or at least give them a path.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I definitely want to reserve a good amount of time to talk about some of those practical solutions, because I agree that's like the primary area that we should be focusing on, especially now. Like, I don't want to get too much into it, but like there's just so much kind of the same stuff going on over and over on Twitter. Like people are just posting the same, memes and saying the same things. And it's just like, okay, like we get it. Like, things are bad. So I do want to get into that kind of stuff, but just going back to your kind of like red pill moment again. With that event that happened and you recognize that there was these lies being told about Bernie Sanders and stuff, why did you eventually kind of go like, when did you move out of that Bernie movement? Like, why would that steer you on another path towards Trump? Because obviously to the onlooker, like they're just two completely different movements.
Yeah. So it really was the Hillary hate. So I think most of the Bernie guys were anti-Hillary for a number of reasons. And so when all of this started to I realized how bad the media was. One of the things this is like cringeworthy to admit, but I was on Reddit at the time. And one of the subreddits was the Donald, right? And while I might not have agreed with the Trump memes at the time, I certainly agreed with the anti-Hillary memes. I thought they were pretty funny. I thought they were pretty spot on. And so I was like, I think a lot of people, it's kind of this ironic thing where they're not really that open-minded, but because they want to be able to say that they're open-minded, right? Like they do certain things, and that maybe is the thing that like opens the door. And so that was kind of for me where I was like, I'm not above like following the Donald subreddit. Like I'm not gonna, scorn these people. Like I'm gonna keep an open mind, and that's basically how I got red pilled. It's just consuming a lot of the memes that came out of the 2016 election, and then also just watched a bunch of documentaries. I watched Clinton Cash, which is great on how the Clintons sold uranium to the Russians, and they were laundering everything through the Clinton Foundation. And then you also had Andrew Breitbart's War, which I don't know if you've ever seen that documentary, but Breitbart Yeah, it's just very sad that he went early. He's just a great journalist, and that documentary also really drove home kind of the degree to which the media machine works to manufacture spin. And so I think a lot of that was really important. And then, I started having conversations with people, and it's one of those things where, if you're in that echo chamber of everyone around you kind of agrees with you, and you just can always kind of have these agreed upon conversations, that's easy. And then you start having a different opinion, and you start talking to people, and you realize how adverse they are to that, right? That they'll push back, and they'll be aggressive, and they'll call you crazy, and they'll put you down. And so it's and I don't know if you experience this phenomenon as well, or what your kind of experience was, if you were always kind of one way or you kind of switched. But I think when you make that switch, the kind of, the antibody response of the people around you kind of kicks into gear. And that almost makes you red pill faster, because you're like, how can these people be pushing back against this? And so then you go out and try to find information so that you can convince them that they're wrong, right? And so it just sends you further down the rabbit hole, and you just kind of accelerate, out of the network. You accelerate out of the herd, so to speak. So
I think only if you're open-minded, though, because I think that's a credit to you for being open-minded, because I think there's a lot of people who would do that rabbit hole journey, and they would just be blinded to anything which contradicts their view, and then they would just kind of double down on anything that reinforces it. I think it takes a certain type of critical mind to really switch your view on things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? One of the conversations we often have in the space is, have we convinced everyone who could be convinced, and now we're just kind of spinning our wheels, right? Because if you look at COVID, you look at the 2016 election, you look at the 2020 election, and all the things that happen around that, right? It's if people aren't fed up already because of, I don't know how spicy your show gets, but drag queen story hour stuff or whatever, I guess you can edit and post if I go to.
Is that a banned topic? Talking about drag queens.
There's different layers, right?
I've never discussed it, so I have no idea.
I think as long as there's certain ways you can talk about it, but if that can kind of pull the ire of certain groups. But okay. Yeah, I mean, the point being, right, is the crazy ideas that kind of are accepted and out there in the mainstream, right? If that hasn't gotten you to reflect a little bit on the possibility that, there might be something more than, what the mainstream is telling you, or that they could be lying about some things, then, is it possible to kind of bring you along this late in the game? I don't know. I mean, a big part of my content at this point is, people will tell me oh, you can't red pill everyone. And I'm like, I'm not trying to. It's more about taking the people who are in this kind of right position of, figuring things out and looking for a positive way to move forward, and trying to kind of shine a light on what that path would look like and bring more people along on that journey. I don't think, one of the common mistakes is people get pulled into projects that they aren't really ready to commit for or be disciplined for. I often say we need to no one's going to save us, right? So you have to save yourself. And when you're working with other people, you have to work with other people who are actively trying to save themselves. And because if you try to bring people in who aren't willing to do the work, right, then kind of become dead weight, and you have to pull them along, especially if you're depending on them for projects, or certain responsibilities, that kind of thing. That can be really tough. And so I think, the people who I'm trying to appeal to are the people who generally already get it. To your point, there's still a lot of discussion about the problems in the space. And I think you have to have that, because new people coming in need to be able to have the argument, and you need to kind of have that front to battle intellectually with the other side. But there needs to be this, okay, now that you got it, what is the solution, right? You understand the problem, how can you go about fixing things? And that's kind of the people I'm trying to talk to at this point, is trying to bring people on to, okay, put the social media away, hang up the phone now that you got the message. The next step is, network building and building these parallel projects.
Yeah, totally. Have you ever, I've mentioned this a few times on the podcast, so people are probably getting sick of me mentioning it, but have you ever read it's called Isaiah's Job? Have you ever read
I have
this?
not.
Man, you should definitely read that. I think that it would really resonate with you. I mean, it's kind of, like super old school stuff. I have no idea like when it was written. I think it was, do I know who it was written by? No, I don't know. But the whole story is essentially about a kind of like a prophet, and he's kind of going around like speaking truth to the world. And the message essentially is just that like you need to speak to the people who are willing to receive it and ignore everyone else. Like you can go for miles and kind of be speaking to endless hordes of people who aren't going to receive the message. But the important thing isn't to kind of just give up and go, oh, you know what? No one's receiving this message. Like I'm on my own. You keep going because eventually there'll be someone who hooks on. And the one person who kind of hooks on and says, okay, I recognize the inherent truth in what you're speaking is kind of like, that makes it worth the kind of pain of all of the people who reject it. And it's, the message almost is just kind of saying like, don't, just kind of succumb to the mob, because like you said, that it does end up being dead weight. You kind of need people who are, it kind of reminds me like when you have these people who are advocating a point of view on like a news discussion thing, like you have a news show or whatever, and you have someone advocating a point and you're like, okay, I agree with them. Let's say you're like pro gun, and then you have someone and they're just doing a bad job because they're not fully in it. They're not fully like, they're not really an advocate, or it's someone who's advocating maybe a political position. You can tell they don't really believe it. Like you need people who are the true believers to kind of go out there. Otherwise you're just kind of carrying people. So yeah, I totally like resonate with that. I think the important thing is you go out, you advocate the message, and you recognize that most people aren't going to get it. They're not going to understand it. They're not open. Their mind is not open. But most of all, I think it's that they're not willing to see the ugliness for what it is in the legacy world. They're not willing to accept they've been lied to. I think that's a big part of it, is like, if I accept now that I've been lied to about this thing, what else have I been lied to about? What else is not real about this paradigm I'm living in? Like that's a big deal for a lot of people to take. And I just think a lot of people aren't ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, RFK was on Joe Rogan, and he was talking about the vaccine stuff. And one of the points he made, there's a lot of people who are really hesitant to accept the truth about vaccines because, for exactly the reason that you're talking about, once you accept that you were lied to about one thing, it forces you to question everything else. And, it forces you to realize that, you were lied to and you were duped. And right, Mark Twain has that famous quote. It's like, it's much easier to fool someone than convince them that they've been fooled, right? And so, I think people are pretty hesitant. I talk a little bit about this in the journey of the kind of the 5 steps and the awakening step. I talk about how what it really takes to wake people up, it's not the work that you're going to do on them. It's that they need to find something that they care about, and then they need to like start to see that contradiction and then dive into it, right? And that's as they dive into that contradiction and they start to pull it apart, right? And that's why you had people who, maybe kind of bought everything hook, line, and sinker. And then, one of their family members, takes the vaccine and then, has some complications or something like that. And like that is, gets them to pay attention, right? For me, it was, the 2016 election and just being really passionate and then seeing that contradiction and being like, oh, I need to dive into this, right? And then I really agree with your kind of message around, making sure that you're not worried about too many. Everyone doesn't need to understand you. The 4th step in the journey is networking. Initially, it was content creation, and as I've kind of thought about it, it makes more sense than networking. But the reason it was, go out and create content is because I think the creation of content, it's very meditative. It helps you think about what is important, what is not important. How do I articulate this idea, right? And so I'd encourage a lot of people, as you're going through your own personal experience, whether it's journaling or talking to other guys or going out, writing articles, creating content, doing podcasts, whatever it is, there's a lot of value in that. Because what it effectively does is it sets up a beacon, right? It's like, these are my ideas. This is the wavelength that I'm on. These are the things that I care about. And the people who that resonates with, that they like that information and they're curious to learn more, they are going to be attracted to that. and then you're going to build those relationships. And so again, it's not about appealing to everyone. How can I make the information broadly appealable? It's find what you're passionate about, and then go find the other people who are also in that kind of passion niche. Because that's a big thing when I encourage people to get involved in projects. I tell them, like, look, you shouldn't just get involved in whatever project, or you shouldn't kind of jump into things. Like, think about, what are you passionate about? Where does your skill set lie? Where can you really help people? The more that you can kind of find a parallel project that is in line with those things, the much more likely it is to succeed and for you to stick with it.
Yeah, totally. What you just said there really reminds me. I had a conversation on my podcast with a guy called John Vallis. So I'll try to remember to put this in the show notes as well. And he's another podcaster. And I can't actually remember if this conversation was on the podcast or whether we did it whether we had this conversation when we weren't recording. But we're talking about how podcasting, which obviously, that's his medium and it's my medium, how when you do podcasting, it's almost like you have to, first of all, exactly like you said, you have to really come to terms with your own ideas. You have to really understand what you're saying. And you might not understand it from day one. It's something that kind of emerges over time, but being forced to think about, the things that you're talking about, you come to these ideas and you kind of like learn where the weaknesses are. But also the other like really important thing, I think, is it holds you to account. And maybe you've found this in your writing and the things that you're doing, is that like when you're putting yourself out there, when you're podcasting, when you're writing, whatever, it's like, that you've got people listening to you, you've got people watching you or reading your work or whatever it is. And you're like, I have to stand by this. I can't kind of like do this and then, like go back on it, or I can't be saying this thing and then I just kind of like go against it in this other part of my life. It's like if you're advocating for certain values, if you're advocating for certain things, you want to stand by it. So I definitely think that like content creation, I agree, like it really has an ability for those people who go into it to kind of like strengthen your resolve, and it strengthens your character and it strengthens your resolve. And people often think, oh, you're doing a podcast, there's so many podcasts, like why do you want to do another? Who's going to listen? It's like, it's not about the listener. That like podcasting is about what it's doing for the individual who's doing it. It's about like, that is a much bigger part of it. It doesn't necessarily matter how many people are listening. And I really like what you were saying about it being a beacon as well. It is like a little beacon of ideas. You're on this frequency and people can tune into it, and someone else over here is on this other frequency. They can tune into that. And then eventually there's an amalgamation through all of it, but you're using like these more decentralized ways of communicating, which overall the frequency is going to be raised, right? Because like outside of that, if we're not putting these little beacons up, everyone's just kind of like stuck here, like listening to, MSM and all this kind of stuff. But the other thing I wanted to touch on from what you were saying, you mentioned that one of the really important steps is that you have something that you care about and you don't recognize the contradiction in. And then if you go into that contradiction, you kind of like learn more, or you realize about how the world works. And that's so funny you say that, because that was literally my experience. So, you asked earlier in the conversation about what was it that, like what was the point of where I kind of like changed my ideas about the world. Like up until about 2016, I was like very big into socialist ideas, like big, I would have considered myself a socialist. I also, at that time, we had a big event going on because we had like the Brexit referendum in the UK. So I was kind of like very like ardently pro-Remain, and, for a bunch of reasons, which I'm not saying like all of them are invalid, but now I think that most of them are invalid. And I've kind of changed my view like quite a lot on that, and certainly the way that I was like framing it and my perspectives around it. But anyway, so during this time, I was trying to get into investing, and I like for the first time I was kind of earning a bit of money. Like before that, I just not really had much, and I was like, okay, I've got a bit of money, like I want to start investing. So I was learning about it, and I was putting my money into these investments, and I was like, oh, I'm really anti-war, but if I put it in this index fund, like they, have investments in Raytheon or whatever, or they have investments in Halliburton. So I was finding that none of the like index funds were kind of like suitable. I was like, this is going into stuff that I just don't agree with. So I was like, okay, well, let's look at some other things. And I started looking into kind of like quote unquote ethical investments. And you actually have, at least in the UK, you have like these ethical investment portfolios, which is stuff like, green energy and all this kind of stuff. So I was looking into those kind of things, and I was like, okay, great. Like I found my ethical investments, and then I would put my money into the ethical investments and just be like, okay, I'm getting no return on this. Like, it's going nowhere. My money is just literally losing to inflation continuously. This is just a dead end. Like, I'm just parking my money into a dead end. And through that, at the same time, I was kind of learning about like dark markets and things like this. And I learned about Bitcoin through that. So during this whole process, I'd already bought Bitcoin, which was for completely other purposes. And like, it wasn't an investment vehicle for me at all. But during that time, I was like, why is my Bitcoin going up more than these investments? Like, I bought these investments. They're supposed to be putting them into these companies, these green energy companies, these like high growth areas, and they're doing nothing. But I'm buying this like cryptocurrency, which should, like, I just was buying it for a privacy tool, but it's going up in value, and it was going up a lot in value. And I thought, like, what is it here? Like, why is this thing more valuable than the investment? So then I went kind of further into that and was like, let's start learning about like what it is, like, why does it go up in value? And then I learned about the actual kind of store of value case and, you know, the inflation hedge and all of this kind of stuff. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, like everything that I thought I knew is wrong. Like I did not understand how finance worked, which underpins everything. And once I kind of swallowed that pill, which was like, you know, every day just listening to like 8 hours of Bitcoin podcasts or whatever, just like, I need to understand this thing. And eventually kind of got to the end of it and was like, I'm never going to see the world this way again. And, you know, just to kind of like bring that back to the original point, is like, the thing for me was I wanted to invest. I wanted to be able to have more money like next year than I have this year. I wanted to be able to do that, because if you think about the way that humanity should work, the way that everything should work, if you lived out in the jungle and money didn't exist, whatever you put into your environment, you go and collect wood or sticks or whatever, you can build yourself a house. Okay, you might not build it on day one, but every day you're going to build towards it, and at the end of it, you have something. We should always be, by our accumulation and by technology, we should always be able to get more for less. Like, we should be living right now in, you know, really great times, because we've got amazing technology. But the problem is, like, the monetary system kind of drains out all of those gains that you would otherwise get from technology. It just sinks everything, because you have governments that come in and go, oh yes, you know, like, we're actually going to just inflate the currencies. So all of this potential rewards you could be getting from these incredible technologies that we've developed, like, we're just going to take all of the gains from that, and then we're going to go and start wars and all the rest of it. And I realized suddenly how that worked. And, you know, I was just like, I'm open to anything now. And I think really from that point on, you know, I kind of got into libertarian ideas. And then by the time, you know, fast forward to by the time COVID came around, I was, you know, I'm not saying I never believed anything about it, because I would say there was a couple of weeks where I actually was probably more of a doomer than the average person. I was like, no, this is really bad. Like, why aren't people all kind of like hiding away in bunkers? And then after a couple of weeks of seeing it, I was just like, you know, looking at these videos in China and stuff, and just saying like, this is just absolute nonsense. You know, like, it's almost comical. If you're not in the illusion, it's comical. But it really took that kind of mind where it's like, if you believe the stuff, if you believe the fundamental paradigm of society, which is that, you know, you're being told the truth by institutions, you'll look at those falling dead images from China and you'll go, oh my God, those people are dropping dead from COVID. But if you know, have kind of like swallowed the red pill, you look at those exact same videos and be like, we're living in a complete clown world. And now it's just a series of clownish events for me. I mean, I just look at almost anything and I'm just like, this is just ridiculous. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of share that, because it definitely speaks to what you were saying about that ability to using that as an anchor to kind of go into, you know, learning about the world.
Yeah. And, you know, the funny thing is, you know, you hear of people who, like, you know, got pilled and then, you know, regressed, right? The left loves to do this, is like, find that one person who was like, you know, you see all these Kamala Harris voters, right? Who are like, I am a redneck farmer, gun owner, and I'm voting Kamala, right? And it's just like, yeah, it doesn't really happen. Like, once you kind of figure things out and you stop trusting the institution, like, there's no going back, right? You just see it more and more and everything. You know, you look at like COVID, you see the videos and you're like, yeah, they're lying, and this is, you know, about money and all that kind of stuff. But the other point that kind of came to mind as you were talking is, I think there's a lot of different pathways towards awakening, right? And that's why I try to keep a lot of my content pretty meta, right, is, some people are being woken up because they want a girlfriend, and the mainstream delusion tells them, oh, you got to be a nice guy and you need to do this, you got to do that, and then they go out and they try that and that doesn't work and they get frustrated by it, right? And they're like, I care about this, I want to go learn. And so they dive into it, the advice that maybe is a bit more taboo, but the advice that they're getting in the mainstream isn't working. Or finance is a big thing. One of my good friends, I don't know if you're familiar with the Peruvian bull, but he was a fairly prolific finance guy during the GameStop thing back in 2021. He got pretty well-known writing on Reddit, and then he's gone kind of mainstream since then. And he's an interesting account. He talks a lot about the dollar end game is kind of his main thesis, but he talks about the dollar milkshake and inflation and how this is going to domino out. And he's been talking about Japan and the issues that they've had, which, it's crazy to me because they basically had a Black Monday level market crash, and it was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and now it's completely memory hold. It's crazy to the degree that we forget things that just happened. But the important point being is that there's a lot of different ways to this, but it's a big part of what drives people is caring about things and wanting to make things better and wanting to be more successful in the world, all this kind of stuff. And before I started the Meta Prime project, I've created websites. I've done a bunch of work in my professional field, which is tech recruiting. Most tech recruiters are not very, usually you're not getting the smart people in tech recruiting or in recruiting generally. And there was a lot of problems with how that was run, and I would write a lot of content. So I was writing articles, and I was actually doing podcasts as well. And one of the things that I focused on was trying to encourage people to take more ownership over how they were thinking about their career trajectory. Because I'd have all of these initial recruiter screens with people across the tech industry, and you think, tech, fairly high paying jobs, requires a lot of knowledge and experience and schooling and all this kind of stuff. And I'd ask these people, why are you interested in, a job with our company, or, what are you looking to do with your career? And the answers would be very superficial. It would just be I want money, or this is something that I like doing, or, they didn't really have a well-reasoned understanding of why they were pursuing certain jobs or career paths. And to me, that's just kind of this lack of intentionality, this lack of drive and ambition. And if you can get people to be more ambitious, to be more driven, to be more passionate, right? You're talking about, you cared about your future, so you were investing and you wanted to do that well. And that's what kind of drove you to pick these things up. I think that's how a lot of people start to wake up, is they care about doing things and doing things better. The other beautiful thing about this, and you see this with kind of Elon and a lot of the tech elite guys, is what we're really all driving at. It's not necessarily conservative values or anything like that. It's truth. The problem is we live in a delusional, this kind of egalitarian utopian delusion of everything is equal, everything's fluffy and nice, and you never have to use violence or be mean. You could solve all problems with rainbows and teddy bears, and it's delusional. And when you are trying to break from that delusion, what you realize is yes, there's these harsh truths out there, but they're true. And in order for us to operate in the world practically, we need to understand these truths. We need to be able to operate on top of them. And I think you've got guys like Elon and all these other people who want to see society run correctly. And I think that's largely what this next election is going to be about, is you have this kind of corrupt, incompetent, old regime that needed lackeys in positions of management who would go along with things. But we weren't getting things done, right? To your point earlier, a lot of this money isn't being built up over time. It's being siphoned off. And people, there's a rising elite class that actually cares about being able to build things, sending rockets to Mars, new technologies that are coming out, being competitive on the world stage, right? Because of the level of incompetence that the U.S. government has managed at this right now, we are, starting to get to a point where we could be outcompeted by other countries in technology and stuff like that. And so, they're kind of stepping in to do that. So I'm pretty optimistic in the long run, just because I think that for things to be successful, they have to be grounded in truth. And those that are not grounded in truth, it's like denying gravity and walking off the ledge, right? It's only a matter of time before they hit the ground. So I think, things are going to shift and change for the better. The big message that I try to get out to people is you don't have to wait for everything to collapse to start building what's coming next. Like, be proactive in building what's coming next. Like, get on the arc to the breakaway civilization early on, because you can help build that. You can build a position in that. You can make sure that it's robust and it's going to be successful. And I think that's the stage that we're at now. You have this declining civilization, but you also have this rising kind of alternative one. And I want to get more people on that kind of rising as I can.
Nice. I do want to talk to you a little bit about like the kind of, I guess, how would I even term them? There seems to be these, I don't want to call them leaders, because I think we'd probably both agree that there aren't leaders, or at least there shouldn't be leaders in this movement. But there does seem to be these certain people who are held up as, I guess, trailblazers for this, what we're going into, this new kind of like epoch that we're going into. And I have huge suspicions about all of them. So I'm, I don't know whether this might be an area that we disagree. So like you mentioned Elon. I have suspicions about Elon. I have suspicions about Donald Trump. I have suspicions about Tucker Carlson. I have suspicions about RFK. Probably I even have suspicions about RFK, like begrudgingly, but I just think that there seems to be these certain people who are being kind of like held up as these are the guys who are going to lead, who are going to usher in this new thing. And especially Elon. I mean, everything is kind of like really being pushed. And I think that like Twitter was such a breeding ground for ideas. And I know that they had their own censorship bullshit going on under Jack Dorsey. Yes, like that stuff was happening. But I do feel like the communities that got together generally got together under that particular kind of like regime, shall we call it. Whereas now a lot of that energy has been channeled towards these big players, towards the big influencers. And everything is kind of just this pyramid scheme now towards like Elon at the helm. And then you've got maybe like, Trump, Tucker Carlson, and, a couple of others like around in those higher echelons. And then it kind of like spirals down from there. And there's all these influencers, and all they seem to do all day is just wait for Elon Musk to tweet something so that they can, get the notification, immediately go in and, post a dank meme or whatever and just, get some hype from it. And I feel actually quite pessimistic about where things are going there. I know a lot of people are like, oh, this is great. We've got this huge, richest man in the world. He's on our side and stuff. I think that he's derailing the movement, not, like operating in the best interest of the movement, whether that is deliberately or whether it's just a side effect. But I don't trust what's going on there. I would much rather see decentralized solutions, even if they take a lot longer to bootstrap. So like, for example, I'm much more excited about what's going on with Nostr and like creating decentralized communications there on a truly uncensorable platform, rather than what's going on with Twitter with, it's great that you've got, for example, you can tweet about vaccines or whatever now, and you won't be censored for saying that. It's good that it's a free speech platform, but just as was said by his, right hand woman, whatever she's called, the WEF person who he for some reason decided to bring in, you can have freedom of speech but not freedom of reach. I mean, I actually preferred it when you had freedom of reach, but you had to dance around the freedom of speech issues. I like the fact that I liked it, but I could get by with the fact that every time I typed the word vaccine, I had to put a V with the at sign, and like a C,
Yeah.
all this kind of nonsense that you had to do, because at least people were seeing it and at least my community was taking a look at it. Now I feel like Twitter has kind of shut down unless you're a big influencer. So yeah, you can say what you want on there, but nobody's going to see it. I'm interested to know your thoughts just about like where things are going there with like digital communications.
Yeah, that is a very big topic. And I think we probably agree more than we disagree on this. The big thing that I always tell people is, one, there's no Deus Machina guy going to show up, out of nowhere and say, I'm going to solve all your problems, right?
Yeah.
Trump, Elon, Andreessen, Thiel, like all of these guys, they aren't our guys, right? Like they're not, they don't want what we want exactly. I would say that, Elon and Trump and those guys are going to be much better than the old regime, right? They're going to be much better than, what's in there currently. We're going to get a lot closer to kind of moving the right direction. And this is the thing, right? Is like, as a group, we need to be thinking in much more long-term kind of plans. So one of the points that I make in the most recent article that I wrote on the kind of the state of the meta is that, I see this is something that Matt from King Pilt podcast has been talking a bunch about. He was on the Prudentialist show. He was on Pete Quinones. But it's basically the idea that the PayPal mafia of like Elon, Andreessen, Thiel kind of group is getting in behind Trump as a way to then get into the administration and clean out the bureaucracy that is preventing them from doing all the stuff that they want to do, right? You saw with a bunch of months back, Delaware threw out Elon's case for the $55 billion bonus that he was supposed to get after the deal he'd made with his Tesla board. So it was a very political move for them to screw him out of $55 billion. He's also had to have these very contradictory requirements around SpaceX, where he's supposed to hire foreigners who aren't citizens, but he also can't do that for information security reasons. And so they have all of these problems, ESG scores, right? Like you name it. There's a bunch of bureaucracy that gets in the way of them building businesses and advancing tech and colonizing space. And so they're getting into the goal, or at least the theory here, is that they're going to get into the administrative side of the government. They're just going to clear out as much of this bureaucracy as they can and kind of install, kind of a new system, a new structure that's more based on practicality and functionability, and because they want the U.S. to be strong, because that's their platform for, protection and economic protection, all this kind of stuff. And again, they're going to promote things like legal immigration and kind of other things that, maybe our guys aren't necessarily like that on board with. But it's going to be a lot closer to what we actually want to see. And the big thing that I encourage people is like, look, we need to be thinking about, okay, this is happening at the top level. There's probably not many Anons who are playing at that level themselves. And so, what can we do at our local level? Well, it's building these parallel projects and getting into business, getting into the economy, right? Like the boomer generation's passing on, and they're going to leave a lot of opportunity for, guys like us to get into businesses, local businesses and stuff like that, to build networks, to build these kind of competency-based digital fraternal networks is what I call them, right? Because I think competency is at a premium right now. It's very hard to find. People talk about the competency crisis and planes falling out of the sky, all that kind of stuff. And so the tech elite, as they go in and they clean out the administration, they're going to need competent people, right? This point I made earlier is like the old regime has a bunch of these lackeys, right? These people who, are going along with things, right? You think of the middle manager that gets mad at you for making the suggestion about changing things for the better because they don't want to be upstaged, right? They care much more about their position than they care about actual, practical, success of the business. And so we're in an opportunity where we can build that kind of local, community-based, small business, like fraternal networks, and then offer that competency up to the tech elite and use that as a pathway, as a bargaining chip, to raise our own elite who are much more going to advocate for what we want. I don't think it's, you have the people who are on kind of the more extreme side of the spectrum when it comes to this stuff, and they say like, oh, he's actually a Satanist, and he's like, this is a complete psyop, and it's all like, 4D chess, blah, blah, blah. I think a lot of these things, I used to have like, crazy conspiracy theory, like I've, been exposed to all that. And, to me, I don't think it's nearly as organized as people, might have you believe. I think it is. The reason that this whole tech elite takeover theory appeals to me is because it's very it's very reasonable from where their incentives are, right? Like they want to build businesses. Elon wants to go to Mars. This stands in his way, right? It makes sense that he would risk and take that on. And so, like I think when I look at a lot of the actions that Elon takes, that's the lens that I take it through. The other point that you make is that there's a lot of these influencers who are like really, it doesn't seem like they're doing anything valuable, that they're really just kind of honed in on being what my good friend Basil calls take sellers in the market, right? They're there not because they actually want to drive forward solutions, but because they want to be popular and make money off the grift. And, a couple months back, I had a blow up in kind of the dissident right community because to me, there was a certain line. I won't go too much into this, but there's a certain line that got crossed by some larger influencers, and I thought I called them out for it. And instead of agreeing that was a line they shouldn't have crossed, they attacked me for it. And it became like a kind of a big event in the space. And there was a lot of people who reached out to me and they're like, wow, this is crazy. Like I wasn't expecting this to happen. Like, and they're like, you're kind of right. And this is very weird for them to do that. And I think what it revealed to a lot of people is there is a large contingent of people on the internet who are creating these personas and doing these things, not because they believe in the first principles that they're putting out there, but because they want engagement and control and power. And when I first got into the space, the reason that I started creating the content that I did was because to me, it was egregious oversight that we didn't have like a orientation guide and like clarity of what those goals should be collectively. And so that's what I started creating. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, this isn't some like great insight on my part. I'm not like some genius that, saw something nobody else saw. Like this is the logical conclusion of, we need to become less dependent on the system. We have to build alternative systems, right? Like people around us don't understand us. We need to network with people who do and get it and are passionate, right? Not huge leaps of intellectual power, right? We need to do this local. We need to be willing to meet people, just do it intelligently and considerate of your operational security, but like you need to do that. And so you see these big figures who are held up as kind of de facto leaders in space, and they're not advocating for those things. Like that's a big concern for me. And I mean, the last thing I'll kind of say on this is that is the case, and it's always going to be the case, right? Like you're going to have people at different points in the funnel, right? Like when I think of Elon and what he puts out, what he's creating, it's not for guys like us. Like we can read the tea leaves and we can kind of see the strategy behind what he's doing. And we'll probably generally agree with a lot of the ideas he puts out, but that's mostly targeted at a mainstream audience, right? He's trying to bring people along, right? Him, like for example, Martyr Made on Tucker, obviously been a big subject the last couple of days. I'm not a fan of Martyr Made. He throws out some bad takes. I haven't like consumed a lot of his content or stuff like that, but it was like maybe a year or two ago, one of my friends got really into his content, started posting stuff, and there were some takes that I like vehemently disagreed with. And even listening to him on Tucker, he dances around certain issues that, and like I kind of get it, and but that being said, I'm not going to like counter signal him or try to drag him down or whatever. Like I think Tucker's a good guy. I think Martyr Made, for whatever, you can take events like that and you can channel them in the right directions and you can do stuff. And there's this a whole outrage that's going on and people are talking about it, and it's good, right? Like it sparks a conversation. It drives things in a good direction. And so, for me, I'm like, I don't have to agree with someone on all their takes or think of them as a perfect person in order to like be happy they're doing what they're doing, or like I can kind of understand where they sit in the network and say, okay, that is what it is, and what I need to do is this, right? Be the beacon for this idea, for this position, and hopefully, more people will see that, more people will gravitate to that. So, to kind of conclude the point here, I think things are very complicated. Everyone kind of has their own desires and drives and motivations and incentives. I think for guys like us who woke up to all this and they want to see things move in a good direction, the best thing is to just keep carving out that niche, like keep bringing people in. And like what the message I like to put out on these podcasts is that there's a huge amount of work being done in this kind of parallel movement area that people are networking, people are really seeing the value of this, people are starting to come together. And, that takes up a lot of my time now. I don't have to worry about that too much. But I do agree with your point earlier is like, it's difficult to have faith that these guys are going to solve all our problems for us. And so we kind of have to be saving ourselves, as I mentioned earlier.
Cool. All right. Nice. Yeah. I guess we don't disagree too much on that point. Okay. I think it's time to go into some of these solutions. Let's start diving into them because this is the most important thing that people need to hear. Just before we do that, though, I just want you. Let's say someone's just joined the conversation right now and they have no idea about any of this stuff, any of like that. There's this whole movement going on. Maybe they're blinded by it. Because I think that there is a lot of people who is blinded to the fact that there is a movement. Like they think that even if they're a bit skeptical about what happened with COVID, which is kind of like the most recent major psyop or whatever, if probably there's been some more minor psyops since, and maybe they're kind of getting a bit of an inkling, but they don't realize that there is a movement of people who have just gone, boom, we're out. Like we're done. We're done with these narratives. Like we don't trust anything that's coming out of the mainstream media. We don't trust any of these institutions and are ready to kind of move on. Like, how would you describe to that person where we're at in the world and what needs to kind of change or what is changing on a kind of macro level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I first started writing the Awakening article, right, the first step of the 5-step journey, one of the points that I make, because I made this, like, part of the reason I wrote the journey is because I made all of these mistakes. I'm just trying to help people like not screw up as badly as I did. But when you first kind of start to figure this stuff out, you're like, oh, I see it now. And I'm going to be the one who's like goes out and tells people and like gets them to get it because like I just got it. Right. But you're largely running off this high because you put the pieces together and it's super obvious to you now, but it's not nearly that obvious to anyone else. Right.
Yeah.
But the other piece of this is there's people who have been around for a long time who have been trying to help people figure these things out. And so like when you're new to the space, it can be really demoralizing initially because you're like, oh, I just figured this out and things are like bad and blah, 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 blah. And you get all, but realize there's a lot of people who have kind of been doing this and they're a lot more kind of low key. They've kind of figured out how to coexist. The ideal that I always encourage people to strive towards is being what I call a master of both worlds, right? You have to have one foot in the mainstream delusion, one foot in the parallel movement. And people do this pretty well, right? Like, my whole thing too is like when you go through that awakening experience and then you come out the other side, right? Like before, I don't know, for me when I was growing up, like the general idea was like, get a good job and get married and have a family and, get a house. Like that's still kind of the goal, right? After you figure out all this stuff, it's not go live in a cabin in the wood and like wait for the apocalypse. So what I encourage people is like, as you're kind of new to this space and you're figuring it out, like your first step, just like it's anytime you're entering a new field, is go out there, read, consume content, find people who are kind of at the right level to talk to. Don't talk to the people who are in your network who are kind of still in that delusion because those conversations are not going to go well. And the more kind of quiet you are, and the more receptive you are, and the more you start to learn, you'll start to pick up like, what are the ideas I like? What are the ideas I don't like? This is not to say that everyone who's in this space is worth listening to or worth following. Like you should expose yourself to a lot of ideas, but I think the people who are worth listening to are the people who are trying to advocate for action and virtue, things that aren't sexy. That's another thing is you see a lot of the people who I don't like in the space, they're going to advocate for things like, whatever, the world's, falling apart anyway, so go be a degenerate or do whatever you want, or, I don't think that's healthy. I think we actually need to network and to build. But the big thing is be optimistic because there's a lot of people here. There's a lot to learn from. To talk about the movement itself, it's basically just guys like you and me who said, hey, look, it doesn't feel like anyone's going to come and save me. I'm going to save myself by creating content, meeting other people, having discussions. You build relationships with those people. I think the important step that we're at now is I've seen a few projects try to happen. Like you have the Asha Logos Ereval team up that did the Back to the Land project. And that was I was very optimistic and hopeful for that. I think that they're still doing some work there, and I think that they might, they might have the land and they're starting to build or something like that. But there was an insane amount of interest initially, and then there wasn't as much organization and there wasn't a lot of cohesion. That's the big thing in my mind right now is in order for these projects to be successful, we need to start building loyalty and trust and stronger relationships inside the community. And I think the way that that can be done is by creating these, initially it's online digital, fraternal networks of just like group chats, people talking to each other and getting a sense of each other. But then it's meeting in person. Some of the projects that I'm involved in out in the Pacific Northwest, the PNW, we have this thing that's called a work party. People, someone has like a homestead or a business, and they'll ping the network of guys and say, hey, this weekend, we're going to have a bunch of people over. Like we'll provide the food, and you crash on the couch, or we got some guest rooms or whatever it is. Come help us with this thing. And so people will show up, and this is how I met the group out here. Is like I came out. One of the guys, the guy was putting together the business, and he just came out and put up a bunch of drywall, right? And it's a great way to get to meet people. You can have these kind of long form conversations, which are great. You get a sense of them. But it also is kind of like a sweat equity. It's like a proof that you're not just going to talk about your ideas, but you're going to show up and you're going to take action. And so that's kind of what's happening right now is you're starting to have these networks form of people who want to, again, save themselves. They're willing to take the initiative and do the work. They're starting to meet up in person. There's starting to be events, like some of the ones that I can talk about openly are the Old Glory Club had something out in Tennessee a couple months back. Wasn't able to make that one, but I heard a lot of good things. There's another one that's coming up on the West Coast. It's like a basket weaving Pacific Northwest group, which, if you're think it's something your audience will be interested in, I can share the link for. But you're starting to have these groups kind of pop up, these meeting places. Not for everyone. And, I think for some people, it's much better to just kind of meet someone local at a coffee shop or, something like that, or just get on a phone call with people who you're kind of like meet online and resonate with. You have to be smart about this, but we are getting past the initial hang up because I think a lot of people have been psyoped to believe, there's a glowing person across, around every corner, and just like, you don't know anyone online, and they're all bots or feds or whatever it is. And, my good friend Arcology, when I first met him, he made a point that I have made many, many times talking about the subject, which is we're often hiding more from our friends than from our enemies. And I want to encourage people to be intelligent and to be careful, but to be optimistic and put themselves out there, because these networks are starting to form. And this is the basis through which these parallel networks and parallel systems are being built. Yeah, well, that's that idea, right? Of like people are worried that you're anonymous online. You're very careful about where you are, who you are, career, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's smart. I think initially there's absolutely no reason to, share too much information. I think it's much better for anonymous accounts to get to know each other through the quality of their ideas. But as you kind of start to establish yourself and you meet other people in the space, and by virtue of the way they can talk about those ideas and stuff like that, like I think there is value in reaching out in the DMs or getting on the, like a Telegram or a Signal call and having a conversation. Like X now has a feature that you can call from account to an account on your phone, which is really nice. And I've used that a bunch of times. Cool. And they end up being people just like you and me, right? Who had some sort of awakening moment. They figured out they like cared deeply about this and they wanted to do something about it. And they're looking for an outlet. They're looking for other people to collaborate and work with. And sometimes I get on conversations with people and it's a quick conversation and, we're kind of like, all right, cool, we're aligned, but we're not working on any similar projects. We're not local to each other or whatever. So, you put them in your Rolodex and you put a pin in, it's fine. Sometimes I have conversations with people and I'm like, oh, you're like an hour drive away and we should meet up and you're working on this project. I'm working on this project. And I mean, I've gotten to the point now in network building where basically every conversation that I have, they might not be a fit for me and, my own personal projects, but I'll be like, oh, you're working on this, you should talk to this guy and you should talk to this guy. And, I'll make those introductions on X and those people will talk with each other. Right. And, it's, that's the thing. It's like, I think, the network out there is just got a ton of good people in it. The vast majority are just good people wanting to be involved in building positive stuff. And if you approach it with that mindset, you're like, I'm going to be careful, I'm going to be smart. I think more often than not, the thing you have to be thoughtful about is not people being malicious, intentionally malicious. It's just people being kind of wasting your time or being not careful with their operational security or stuff like that, right? It's those are the people who you should kind of try to avoid, because you don't want to spin your wheels with, working on things with people who aren't serious. And so I think like that's the biggest piece of advice that I give people is, there's a lot of good people out there. Make sure you find the ones that are like serious about doing the work that you want to do. And that's why I think, at the beginning, take time, get to know people, build that sense of trust first before you jump into any projects. But I think the vast majority of people out there. And the other thing that I'll quickly say before kind of wrapping this thought up is we have different groups who have different opinions, right? Like we have the most iconic one in the space is like the pagans versus the Christians, right? And for me, it's like, well, you guys are both oriented towards good, positive ideals. You might disagree on, things religiously, but the enemy who exists on the other side of this, right? Whether you think of it as just chaos and disorder, or if, you kind of attribute to some like nefarious group kind of working behind the scenes, like that's a lot worse than, working with like the pagans or the Christians, right? Like you guys can get along in service of like making sure that humanity doesn't go through this dark age, right? And so that's another big thing that I try to encourage people is like, there's a lot of good people out there. Like, don't get too hung up on like the minute differences that are kind of irrelevant to this important, goal of building. And if you go about this the right way and you have a high quality filter for, the people that you're going to meet, like what comes out of that is amazing. Like I'm at a point in my life now where, I have so many good connections with people across the space. I always feel like I can have a conversation. Like it's weird when I go out and talk with people in normie world now, because I'm like, oh, you don't get like, I'm so used to assuming that people kind of get where I'm coming from with a lot of these ideas. I'm pretty lucky in that regard. And I think that's something a lot of our guys want is they want to feel like they're understood by, and they have like a good group of guys. And I think it's eminently achievable.
Right. Okay. Just, I do want to come back into like more specifics on some of these projects. I'm really interested to know what they're about, but you've kind of piqued my interest a little bit talking about the kind of Christians versus the pagans and that kind of thing, because there is a big thing going on, which I think is increasingly a large part of the conversation that's happening, which is this idea of, that essentially there's a demonic force out there and that there's like a force for good, which is happening, and that there's kind of like prophetic things happening in the world. And we saw it with the Olympics recently, and some of the iconography was basically kind of like overtly kind of demonic. And even myself, as someone who doesn't really get, like, I've not really looked too much into these things or spent too much time going into the whole idea that there's some kind of a demonic element at play. It's hard not to notice it. I'm interested to know your views on all of that stuff and where you stand on it.
Yeah, this is a very deep rabbit hole. I'll try to give it as much of a kind of brief but high level and comprehensive summary as I can. So I consider myself a perennialist. If you've ever read Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, it's not a new idea. I sometimes call it meta-spirituality, but it's the idea that all religions are different interpretations of the same thing. Well, you call that God, a higher power, divinity, the universe. It doesn't really matter. You're just like physics is an expression of these kind of natural laws of how things work. Religion is a framework, an expression of how the spiritual works. And so there's different ways you can interpret it, just like you can say an idea many, many different ways. You can have, and there's still an objective element to it, right? So it's not like anything that you say in religion is just true, right? It's like the spiritual operates a certain way, and like you might have a framework that's better or worse at doing that, that aligns people in a better or worse way. I think there's also something to be said for certain cultures, certain groups of people are going to be better disposed to certain religions because that religion is just, part of their history and part of their culture, right? Like, and so all of that to be said, I very much believe in the spiritual side of things. I believe in God or divinity or however you want to call it. I had, going through my awakening experience, and one of the parts of that was not just kind of the awakening to the political and all of that, but it was also the spiritual awakening to divinity and how all that works. And that's part of the reason that I consider myself like culturally Christian, but spiritually perennial, is because I think that there's a lot of value in the Christian religion and the ethos. But when I first had these kind of divine experiences, I experienced that without the Christian lens, and so it was hard for me to be like, oh, well, the Christianity is the right religion, everything else is wrong, or like that's just, I just kind of see it in that meta way. And the value of that, it works in the sense that I am trying to bridge the gap between different people. So when I talk to pagans or when I talk to Christians, I'm saying like, look, I believe in what you believe. I believe what you believe is true. And we can talk about these ideas and these concepts and how they work. And, to me, you're just understanding things from different angles, right? Like the Christian ethos is much more about like the singular, source God, right? And what that means. And then for them, like angels and demons are kind of, in that pantheon, they're not God. And that's kind of the best way to think about it, is if you're like a pagan and you're thinking about the pantheon of gods, right? They are elements of, like the divine and the spiritual, but they're kind of, if you think of it as dimensions, right? And like God, source prime is like the highest dimension, then, there's intermediate between our dimension and that. And those are spiritual beings, or like exist in that space, and they aggregate in different ways and stuff like that. And one of the ways you can think about it is kind of from like a Jungian perspective. You have Jungian archetypes, right? So you have the devouring mother, you have the tyrannical father, you have the hero, the fool, right? And when you meet people in the world, you can see those elements inside of them, right? And one of the ways you can think about this is it's like, that's like a 4-dimensional thing, like an egregore, a concept, a spiritual entity that manifests in our 3-dimensional world, like in many different ways, right? You think about like communism or any of these other kind of like woke ideologies. When you meet people who have, you can ask them a few questions, you immediately know, oh, you're consumed by this woke ideology. I'm not speaking to like a person. I'm speaking to like a greater thing that is always giving me the same answers for the same reasons, right? And so that's a big part of how I see the spiritual, is we are engaged in a spiritual war. I think that, orienting towards creation and towards virtue is a very important part of how we win practicality. I believe that we're here on earth to learn about ourselves, our creator, and, creation. And like through understanding ourselves and creation, we learn about our creator. And, to me, there's an importance to acting the right way. You're kind of talking earlier about how with podcasts or any type of creative work, you're going to advocate for certain things, and you kind of like think to yourself like, shit, if I'm advocating for virtue, like I also need to be virtuous, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big part of this. Is, to me, the spiritual thing is a whole conversation that we could have, but I'd say that the biggest point that I'd want to make here is, for me, the spirituals, it's a running theme in my work, because I think having that connection to divinity and spirituality is necessary to maintain that optimism, to maintain that groundedness, to feel like you have confidence in what you can do, and kind of knowing that you're not just a material being and that you have to like worry about dying and all this kind of stuff, right? Like the value that spirituality gives you, that there's these transcendent things to aspire to, and that there's these transcendent things that are important beyond just the material, right? It helps us be steeled in our resolve to like do the things that need to be done.
Yeah. I love that, man. That was a really nice not explanation, but just the way that you kind of worded it and talked about these things, I think is really good. And I agree with a lot of it. I think, one of the things that really resonated with me in terms of what you said there was the way that you live actually like is super important and has this tangible impact. Because I think you can look at that from the lens of saying like, you might look at it from the traditional Christian lens and say, you have to be a good person, and this means that you will go to heaven. This means that you will be accepted into God's kingdom, all of this kind of stuff. But you can also look at it and just say, like, even in this world, if you are a good person, you will suffer less. Or if you are a good person, you will, become more in touch with truth or whatever it is. And I think that truth and God are very, very similar. I actually think that they're synonymous. And I think that the more that you live in line with truth, the more aligned you are to God. Like the more that God manifests itself as something that you can really tangibly understand in your life. And I think that but the first step is like, how do you know truth? Like, how do you fundamentally know truth? And there is the kind of spiritual task of saying like, well, I have to like, first of all, reject lies. Like truth is kind of what's left once you filter out all of the lies. So how do you recognize lies? Like it keeps kind of coming back, but ultimately what it comes back to is you have to have an honest look at the world and not be kind of not have your worldview and your actions and stuff muddied by dogma. You have to be able to say like, there's something within me that's been put there, which I can recognize truth in the world outside of someone telling it me. Like if I go to communist China and I see that they're, like killing off political opponents or whatever it is, or whatever the harm that's being done. I mean, we would, like most people would say, even if you are like a kind of like a leftist woke person or whatever, who generally have very, very contradicting views, you put that person in, a dictatorship and saw the government killing people, for example, they would generally say, okay, cool, yeah, I can recognize this. I can recognize that this is inherently wrong. But then you kind of like climb up that ladder a little bit to things that I guess are a bit closer to home and maybe not so obvious. And questions right now, like things about for example, like the trans movement and things like that, it's this idea of like, should we accept people kind of like disfiguring themselves and say, no, that's okay because that's the way they feel inside and they hold, they are the judge of their own truth, etc. And therefore, if they feel like a woman, we have to accept them as such? Or do we say, no, actually, you know what? I don't want to upset this person's feelings. I don't want them to feel bad. I don't want them to feel upset that I haven't validated their identity. Like I'm not here to harm this person, but sometimes people need to be told what the truth is and they need to digest it, because actually the lesson for them is to say, no, you know what? Like I might feel like a woman, but I know I'm objectively not. And sometimes that might seem like the wrong thing to do. It's like, oh, you're being, you're not affirming someone, like you must be some kind of far right, whatever. It's like, well, no, I'm not affirming that person, but I'm doing that out of love for them. I'm not doing that out of hate for them. I'm doing them out of love for them, that they come to an understanding of truth for themselves, because only through that can they then come in touch with what God is for them. So yeah, I've kind of strayed from the point a little bit here, but just to say that, like, I think the first thing is like we have to always be assessing like what's true and kind of leaning into that, and you have to do that through feeling the world out. You can't do that by being afraid of it, and that I would say is probably like the first step. Is, can you like let go of fear? Because normally, like accepting truths, like the most spiritual kind of development you're probably going to have is accepting a truth which is really, really difficult to accept. Like all of my spiritual kind of like leaps forward has always been, you know what, I've got this comforting lie in my life, and I've had to kind of look at it honestly and go, I have to let go of this idea. And I think that's something which the individual has to go on. And through that, that's how you end up where we are. So I think that, the reason that we're able to have a conversation like this, where we just really kind of get these concepts, which other people listening who might not have gone on this journey might just be like, what the hell are these guys talking about? I think that the reason that we can talk about it and understand each other is because we have gone through that process of saying, I'm willing to let go of the lies that are comforting and lean in towards truth. And then through it, you can kind of like self-actualize. And ultimately that's what it's all about. That's why I don't sit back and kind of lament everything that's happened in terms of, the journey that I've been on and, the freedoms that I've had taken and all this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, that it's not great. It doesn't feel great, but these things just give you the opportunity to evolve, and there is a verse in the Bible. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but it's something to the effect of like, God will only give you the challenges which you are kind of capable of overcoming. Like you'll never be given a challenge that you're not capable of transcending. And through the transcending of challenges is how you do self-actualize. And right now we're being dealt these big kind of societal level, like these community level challenges, as well as on the individual level. Everyone's being tested on the individual level. When it came to like someone saying, I'm going to inject you with the vaccine, like yes or no, that's a very individual choice. But then on the whole of society, we're being dealt with these ethical questions like, okay, what do we do with this? What do you do when your government is forcing you to do things? What's the I guess, to maybe how you would term it is like, that's the meta question, right? The meta question is like, we need to ask about the ethics on a general level and what's the right direction of society, but it all starts in the individual. It all starts from one person saying, I'm going to make a choice that's right for me, external to all of the dogma that I'm being fed. And through those black sheep that emerge in all these different places, now we're starting to network, right? And that's and now it's getting exciting because the black sheep are all coming together and saying like, we're going to form our own systems, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great video that came out recently. It was like an independent creator. I'm completely blanking on the name, but like just beautifully done. And that was whole thing where it's like, all these people like asleep with like eye blindfolds on, and then they kind of wake up to things, and like the guy like goes and grabs the sword. There's just like a movement, right? And I think you're absolutely right. It's like these black sheep are coming out. But to the point you were talking about earlier with like truth, and the big thing for me when it comes to a lot of this stuff is there's what's true, right? And there's what's not. That's an objective thing, right? And there's different interpretations, there's different frameworks. You're never going to perfectly encapsulate truth or understand it, but you can get pretty close, right? Like the goal is to create a framework that allows you to interact with the world in a way that you can kind of get what you want. And the world itself is kind of incentivizes certain interactions, right? It's like I think of the goal of life is to flourish. And it's a pretty general idea, right? Things that live continue on, things that die stop, right? But what is flourishing on an individual level? Well, being healthy, working out, taking care of yourself, building good connections with people in the world around you. But flourishing is also putting out healthy patterns, right? So building businesses where other people can make money, and you're building a product that is, other people like, right? Having kids, and, building a family, and, supporting other people, like all of that stuff is flourishing. So it's beyond you on an individual level. But in order to achieve that, right, you're going to run into challenges. Right? The world isn't easy and perfect and whatever. And so you have to learn about yourself and the world around you through those challenges. Like, what am I capable of? What do I know? I met this challenge. What do I understand about that? What do I need to learn in order to overcome that, right? And so that process of engaging with the challenges of the world, how you develop yourself and the understanding for the world around you. And so when I see people who are, still in this delusion, right? And, you bring up like the trans thing, like to me, this is a problem not only of the biological transhumanist movement, but also the techno-transhumanist movement. So you have people who are saying like, oh, you got to put like the Neuralink in your head or become a cyborg or, all this kind of stuff. And, my guiding light with all this is there is a natural, objective truth to how we as human beings, at not only how the world works, right, from like a physics standpoint, but also as we as human beings, we operate. What we find fulfilling and meaningful is also indications that we're moving towards the good, right? So the example that I like to use here is you can get into that flow state when you're doing something that's engaging, whether it's like a sport or video games, or you're having a good conversation. And flow state, basically what it is it's when you're kind of challenged at the upper level of what you're capable of doing. That it feels good. Your time goes away. You spend the whole, day working on whatever it is, right? You're in the moment. And the reason that it feels good is because your body wants you, just like naturally good for you to do that, right? Like to push yourself and to challenge yourself and to create things, right? And so we have this biological response to taking the correct actions in life of engaging with challenge at the edge of our competence. It's not an accident, right? It's not some like coincidental thing. Like the people think of the material and the spiritual as being inherently separated. They're intertwined. They're like superimposed on each other. They're like integral to the point where you can come to a lot of the spiritual ideals and values and stuff like that from a fairly purely material standpoint. And so when I think of people who are making decisions that are contrary to reality and the truth, I think that you're absolutely right. Like there's this idea that's pushed that we have to be nice, right? I call this toxic tolerance. That you're sparing people and you're allowing them to do what they want to do, and it's their life that that they can value whatever they want to value, all this kind of stuff. I think that's garbage. I think there's an objective value to how we should live life, and there's objectively true things. And if we care about people, we don't want to see them suffer unnecessarily. And one of the biggest ways that you suffer unnecessarily is by being divorced from truth, from reality, not knowing that you're going to suffer later. And this is something we see in the suicide rates when it comes to trans, right? Like these people are not happy with the life that they're living. They were told, and I think largely they're trying to fill a spiritual hole. They're told like, oh, you're not happy with things. The way you're going to, figure that out, it's just the reason you're not happy is because you're, trapped in the wrong body. And if we switch that for you, everything will just be fine, right? And I think what people are doing is they're avoiding the challenges of their life by trying to find this quick fix that's very accepted in mainstream, and in they kind of gain this notoriety bump from it and all this kind of stuff, but it's effectively hollow. And so for me, you might, the mainstream people might say, oh, you're being mean or evil by saying stuff like this. I think it's like, no, I'd much rather people realize the truth and live by that truth, even if it means their life is going to be more challenging and difficult. You had made the point, like, you just kind of accept it. You become stronger. And I think that that's a message that a lot of people need to hear is that should be your goal, is your life flourishing. The way you do that is you become stronger so you can help the people around you, and you just accept the harsh realities of the way the world works, because once you accept them, then you can deal with them. Right? If you're dealt a bad hand in poker, like you still got to play the game, right? You still want to lose those chips. So I think that's the direction that we need to go. There's definitely a big spiritual element to it. It's all intertwined, but I think that we need to get over this idea of being mean. One of my good mutuals online, Woe from the Stone Choir podcast, he talks a lot about this stuff from a Christian perspective, and he's really leaning in a lot to this being mean and violence and all this kind of stuff, which sounds bad on it, it's on its surface, right? It's like, oh, we don't want to be violent, we don't want to be mean. I agree, generally that is something you want to avoid, but I think that if you never see in what scenario violence could be justified or being mean could be justified, then you're cutting yourself off from a lot of things that actually need to be done. And so I think there's, even when you start to figure things out, right? Like even when you have your like awakening experience, there's typically tons and tons more of awakening experiences that come after that. And one of the ones that I think our space is going through largely right now is, are we willing to be aggressive, mean, and harsh with the truth, or pushing back against our enemies, knowing that, we like to think of ourselves as like the group of virtue, and that we follow these higher ideals, and we're ultimately better than other people because we're actually the group of people who are nice and friendly and all that kind of stuff. And I think you need to have both. You need to be able to be nice and friendly when it makes sense, and you need to be able to be mean. And it's not about like being mean for being mean's sake. It's about protecting what is good, right? If you do something bad in service of virtue, I think that the action itself is colored by what it's in service of. And so if you do something in service of a virtue, that's good. If you do something in service of a vice, that's bad. That action might be the same, But it depends on what it's in service of. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations of what is valuable and what is good and how do we move forward, because I think people are going to have to take actions that they might not feel comfortable with, but are very ethically and morally defensible. Like illustrating that you don't have to play inside the rules that they set for you. I think that's freeing for a lot of people and what they need to hear.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about there pertains to like just having temperance. Like you need to be able to, like, especially as we start winning, because it's always easier to have temperance when you're not kind of like winning. But as the tide starts shifting and the things that we've been kind of predicting turn out to be true, and the direction we've been advocating for, we start getting more and more of those wins. It becomes easy to kind of like lose that temperance and to start kind of doing or saying things, I guess, just in this energy of like, well, we're in control now and you guys are on the other side or whatever. I saw this video the other day of there was someone like wearing a mask at a petrol station, and this guy just kind of like leans out of his window and he's like, "Do you wear that when you're masturbating?" And like it's like it's kind of funny. Like it's not that it's not funny, but I also kind of I looked back at that and kind of thought, like, is that the energy that we should be channeling, right? Like we've kind of like we've come to the other side of this thing with the COVID and the mask and all this kind of stuff, and I think that a lot of those people are feeling kind of embarrassed, like who really went along, the people who wore the mask in the car and did all this thing of like, I'm gonna walk into the pub wearing the mask, and I'm gonna sit down and take it off and put it on to go to the bathroom, all this nonsense. I think that they're feeling kind of embarrassed, and I think that the better thing to do, rather than screaming stuff out of your car window and kind of being like making that person just feel like an idiot or whatever, I think the better thing to do is to just try and kind of sit down with these people and say, okay, look, we went through this big thing. You got the jab. Do you regret like doing that? Do you feel like maybe you should just paid a bit more attention to what kind of some of the more alternative health people were saying, or perhaps it's like you wore a mask for all this time, and or you didn't have proper connections with people, like perhaps someone has a child or whatever and they were wearing a mask during those formative years, or whatever it is. Like just to have those conversations a bit more gently, because I think that the temptation is to just get into this tribalistic state where you're just channeling, I guess, we have a lot of anger within us, I think, from going through these years and kind of feeling like, we've had these freedoms taken away, and, we've been gaslit, and all of these kind of things have happened. And it's, the temptation is now like, okay, I can unleash, I can kind of open up that valve now and let these people know what I think. And I think the better thing to do is to just try to be like loving towards those people, like even if you strongly disagree with them, and just say like, okay, what's the thing that this person needs to hear? Because if you just do that, that person who heard that person scream it, are they going to go away and be like, oh, that person's right, they got me? Or are they going to go away and be like, that guy's such an asshole, like, he's screaming at me through his, like, what a crazy, like, nut job. He's exactly like the media's been telling me, like, these far right nut job people. I think that we want to be careful not to play into that. And so I think that we need to start thinking more about these, like, values that have stood the test of time. And I think that temperance is one that is just a bit lacking at the moment, but hopefully we'll kind of like get there.
So I have a little bit of a nuanced take on this, because I agree with you. I think fundamentally one of the most important things when you're having conversations with people is you want to give them a path that allows them to agree with you, but doesn't make it difficult for them to do so, right? Like if you're in a situation where you're like, I'm right and you're wrong and here's why, and you're an asshole and you're bad for being wrong, and all, you make it so that if they agree with you, they also have to agree with all of these negative things about themselves. Yeah. It's not good. You're not going to get a lot of people who can like swallow their pride in that moment and do all of those things, right? And so it's much better to frame things like, hey, look, like these pharmaceutical companies, they've done this before, right? With the opioid epidemic, where they pushed things that were not good. They fudged studies, all of this kind of stuff. Like, you make it about like those guys are evil, right? And like we're collectively, getting the short end of the stick here, and and you can advocate for things that are a little bit softer than like fuck the vaccine. You'd be like, I think it's really important that people be able to make their own decisions about X, Y, or Z thing, right? Like there's ways strategically you can go about that. And I'm a big believer that, if you're local, the people around you in your community and stuff like that, like treat those people with respect, because you got to live with, again, one foot in the parallel movement, one foot in the mainstream delusion. That being said, I do really like that there is a group of people who go hard. And there's two reasons for this. One, I think that there are people who are never going to be persuaded, that are never going to change, right? And that you don't want them to be nice to those people. You want to be able to be mean. There's people with agendas, right? You think of like content creators online who are very aggressive about what they push, and like you need people who are willing to punch back. Like I don't think we can be so soft that we can't do that. The other thing is, a lot of the times when I have arguments with people online, the way I see it is, it's not about convincing that person. It's about convincing the people who are reading that conversation later, right? And so from that lens, you ask yourself, okay, how can I frame this? How can I respond to this in a way that makes this person seem a little bit like an idiot? Like I'm fine with doing that, right? Not giving him the out of like a graceful agreement, but makes a compelling case. And so I think that depending on who your audience is and how you want to interact with them and how close they are, I think that that's the nuance, right? That's the nuance that's hard to get across in a tweet or even in an article. That's the value of a podcast, is we can sit here, we can have this conversation and agree that people have to, temperance is good, and thinking about these things critically, and not just, because a part of this too is the guy just screaming out his window. That might be like a lack of his confidence and his, in himself, and like his acceptance of like the world around him, that he has to lash out at other people, right? Like that's not necessarily a good thing. But I think talking about the cases in which it's okay to be aggressive, or that you're not trying to convince the other person, you're trying to convince the audience that's reading it. I think that helps illustrate the nuance that a lot of people don't normally get in these kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and I definitely think that there is always just lines where you just go, well, what you're advocating for is so against my values that at a certain point I have to draw a line and defend them. And, hopefully that defending them is just, I just tell you a very straight, no, it's not happening. But obviously there are times when it goes beyond that. And, this is one thing that I do actually like about, in America, that you've got like the Second Amendment, and people are just like, no negotiation, just like, sorry, no negotiation. That's it. Like, it's not happening kind of thing. And that's something that I think that we're kind of lacking in Europe, is that we don't have this absolute just red line. And, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, because I do think in America they're, not to sound like the cliche, but like, they're coming for your guns. They're coming for your guns. Like, I think it is actually happening. So
we have like 120 guns per every like 100 citizens or something like that. Like we have more guns in the US than we do people. It's a pretty crazy situation. But, my thing, and this kind of gets back to, the movement and what we're doing is, there's this, the analogy I like to use here is, I don't know if you had this growing up in, like elementary, middle school or whatever, but they had these coin drives where each class would have like one of those like water cooler jugs, and people would put money into them. And if you put a penny into your own class's jug, you'd get like +1, right? It would be, you get plus a cent. If you put any amount of money, any other form of money, whether it's like quarters or dimes or dollars or whatever, into any of the other jugs, that class would lose that amount of value. And what you quickly should realize from this is like, okay, well, if I'm putting pennies into my own class, well, I'm +1 versus all the other classes. But if I put like a quarter into somebody else's class, like, yes, my class relatively went up 25 cents, but it also did that for all the other classes. Like I didn't gain on the other classes. I just pushed that one further down. And I think that's why I advocate so much for building as opposed to just running around tearing things down. I do think that there's people who should be doing that. And there is constructive elements to like tearing down these like little NGOs that are just clearly money laundering schemes, feeding off the system and exposing, people here and there and whatever. But like, say we're successful in tearing everything down, like what's left? Like, where do we go to? What is, and so that's why for me, it's so important to talk about where energy is best spent. It's also much more encouraging if you're around people who are building stuff. And so that's why I want to get people on that wavelength. The question then becomes, well, how do you do that? And this is a question I hear more and more because I think people are getting on that, like, let's build stuff wavelength. And some of the ideas that we've already talked about, like create content, like even if you have a small Substack and you're putting stuff up, or you're a reply guy to some of your favorite accounts on X, like that builds a reputation. You start to get to know people. Like you want to get into a group chat is basically what you want to do, or reach out to people in the DMs and just, hey, I like your work. I'd be interested in jumping on a call. Like a lot of people are pretty receptive to that. And then start building these networks, building these sense of trust, and then finding these projects that you can get involved in. Like I'm a big advocate of people moving geographically if they don't feel like they're in a location where they can, really build what they want to build or have the community. I think having a few local guys that you can trust, right? If the power goes out or the internet goes down, like people you can still contact and connect with, like that's really, really important. I don't know if we'll need it, hopefully not, right? But I wouldn't be surprised. And I think that having that is it's kind of essential to any like legitimate comprehensive plan. But I know we wanted to talk like a little bit as we're kind of wrapping up on, the kind of moving to those projects and what those look like. And I think that networking side of things is where a lot of people are starting to think. And so I've written extensively about that. And I think that the digital space is a really good way to do that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I know I did say we would come back to the projects thing, and then we kind of got sidetracked on some other interesting topics. Sometimes like I see a thread and I just want to kind of run with it. So, but just to I guess just briefly go back on the projects, aside from what you mentioned about like building dry stone walling or like setting up, I guess, some kind of like generator or whatever in case the internet goes down, are these the kind of projects that people are building then? Is it mostly kind of, I guess, like building off-grid systems and things like that? Or
yeah. So the way I see it is a lot of people, I was having a conversation with someone recently about this, where a lot of people feel like the only viable projects are these like big, grandiose, like breakaway civilization. We're going to go out and like build Atlantis or, kind of things. And I think when they hear like, no, it's, went over to a buddy's place and I helped him put up fence, and he we helped him dig a well or whatever it is, right? Like these kind of more like very seemingly mundane things. They're like, oh, that's not nearly as exciting as I was hoping to, like escape off to the bunkers, and be doing like anti-gravitics experiments or whatever. It's like, yeah, like we might get there eventually, but the goal right now is network building. It's getting that sense of trust and community built. And I think there's a lot of good ways to do that. And again, you have to be a master of both worlds. It's not about like going off into the woods and starting these little isolated communities. Like that has no ability to change things. We need to be riding the tiger when it comes to technology and AI and all this kind of stuff, right? Like you can't abstain from it. You have to find a way of getting involved and controlling it in a healthy way. That's why I kind of go back to that natural humanist kind of way of seeing things. And so when it comes to projects, right, the projects that I'm personally working on is like, these work parties. And I think this is a model that more people should be using is, have like a network of guys who, meet up and like initially can just be grab drinks. Like there's the basket weaving group that's out in the Pacific Northwest. Like they just like go to a bar and hang out with each other. I know that there's other things that have done that. One of my buddies, Thad, he's up also in the Pacific Northwest area, and he's like a big advocate of what he calls dance hall nationalism, which is, go do country swing dance at, a local place, right? It's a great way to meet like people who are fit and, like do something that's, wholesome and positive, right? And you get to meet those people and build those relationships. And, he goes to competitions and stuff like that. He's also really into crypto, right? And so that's another whole nother thing. It's like, getting involved in the crypto community. But, these work parties are great because you're putting in sweat equity. You're proving that you're willing to be there. You're getting to know people. You're having a lot of these conversations. These are usually like local people, and the work that you're putting in, right? Like that's going towards making that person's, home, doing a bunch of projects in their home or helping them out with their business. I think there are a lot of kind of easy targets for businesses. I think gyms should be a big thing. I think our guys need like gyms and bars and recreational hangout areas. Like the more that we can get our guys kind of owning those businesses, building culture there, using that as kind of there's this sociological term called third places, right? And places that aren't your home or your work, right? Like the coffee shop or the bar or the the shooting range or whatever it is, right? And if we have more guys kind of owning businesses like that, running them well, being able to make money for themselves and all that kind of stuff. And then those can be, hey guys, come out, help me with this project, or, come out to the range and shoot. And I'll introduce you some other guys. Right. And then from there, a lot of other projects are starting to spawn. So, more kind of cerebral projects like, won't talk too much about this, but I have a friend who's building a networking app and, and he has a whole vision around that. Right. And like, like I mentioned, like Thad running his crypto platform, like his vision for that is to be a crypto platform where, our guys can use that to store and maintain their wealth, to be able to get it on and off, without having to like worry about the government being involved and all this kind of stuff. And so there's these other projects. There's an alternative education parallel system being built by another gentleman I know. At some point that'll go, I'll be able to talk about it and goes mainstream. And so there are these kind of higher level, broadly arching things. But I think that if people are just hearing this for the first time and they want to get involved, the best thing to get involved in is local stuff. So, joining the search and rescue, joining the volunteer teams, going to, like local hiking group events or whatever it is, right? Like get to know the people in your area. Go to things. This is something I talk in the network article. Like figure out you have beacons, bonds, and momentum. Those are kind of the three elements of a network. So the beacon is that thing we talked about earlier. It's like the idea that kind of shines and attracts people that who are kind of like can see that wavelength. Bonds are the connections between people, which are really important to things being successful. And the momentum is just how long has that network existed? Because if it's only existed for a short time, to be honest, there's a good chance it's going to fall apart. But if it's existed for a long time, good chance it'll stay together, right? So you look at something, you say, has this had momentum over time? And I'd encourage people like locally when you're kind of looking to build these networks, like search these things that are very our guy coded, like go to them, have these kind of like surface level interaction conversations with people. And you can kind of get a sense of like, who are the people that are a little bit more with it. And, that's a great way to build relationships. Or, if there aren't things like that in your area, like start one, like have like go on Facebook and say, hey, I'm going to show people how to put together an emergency preparedness kit. And we'll bring some people, we'll just have this in the park and, here are the supplies you have to bring and we'll put it together and we'll do like a little thing about it or something like that. Right. Like there's a lot of ways that you can do that. It does take a little of an initiative and you're putting yourself out there and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's where I would encourage most people to start and know that as you start to connect and as you start to do more stuff online, you'll find the bigger arching projects that are happening. I think eventually too, there's going to be a crossover between like the tech elite and what we're building on a local level. They're going to be looking for competency networks. And if you're building these kind of fraternal organizations, both local and digital, that once there's that connection that's made and there's this overlap, like that's a huge game changer. And I think, we're starting to see that in a lot of different ways. But I think the biggest piece of advice for people is just reach out, take the initiative, look, DM people. I think you'd be very surprised the positive reaction that you'll get from many people in the space.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, really good advice. I definitely think that like we need to get more in touch with that local communal stuff. I mean, obviously, just for building stuff up, but even just for resiliency. I mean, I think that we need, like, it kind of took us a bit by surprise when, like all these places were shutting down or were forcing you to wear a mask or take a vaccine. It would have been really nice to just be like, oh, I'm really familiar with what's going on locally. I know exactly the place I can go. I feel like now people are kind of beginning to like spot each other, like seek each other out, get an understanding for, their belief systems. And then you want to support those businesses as well. Like, I mean, I know a lot of people tried to build these apps and stuff around COVID where it was like, these are the freedom supporting businesses, and it was all a bit all over the place. People sharing like Google Sheets like around and stuff, just being like, here's a list of businesses. It's like, you have no idea whether that's like true or not. It's very hard to build trust networks. They're incredibly difficult to bootstrap, but the best way, like you said, is just to actually know people locally. Let's just get involved and you'll figure it out.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Like, working on this, it's not about the ideas, it's not about the interest, it's not about like the people, it's about the trust. And that is kind of the big hurdle that we're trying to figure out. And the solution that we figured out when it comes to trust is, are you willing to put in sweat equity, right? Are you willing to do the work and, show up, put up the drywall, like put up the fence, whatever it is, right? 'Cause that is the biggest indicator that someone is, not just talk, but actually wants to take action.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Man, this has been a really awesome conversation. I still feel like there's a lot of rabbit holes we could have gone into, but it seems like a good point to wrap it up. So maybe we'll save it for another one. Do you want to just let people know where they can find you, like all your channels and stuff like that, where they can find your writing? And then just if you have any final parting words as well for my listeners, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So my content, I do have a website, just metaprime001.com. That has like a lot of my content, my evergreen content, pretty well organized. I also have the Substack. On the Substack, I also put up the podcast. The podcast is also up on Spotify. Most of the podcast episodes are guest episodes, so similar to this, where like find interesting people in the space, want to have a conversation. So I've had some good ones there, and we've got one. I did recently one with Gord of the Voice of Gord podcast. He was part of the Canadian Trucker Convoy. He was on Tucker Carlson a month or two ago. I'd actually met him bumping around the sphere in person. He's a really great guy, but he talks a lot about we talk about the competency crisis and what's going on in trucking. And where he kind of sees things going as far as in Canada. So that's kind of a little bit of the vibe of the podcast. A lot of the writing is, a lot of the discussion that we've had today is like the journey, the process. What does networking look like? What are we aspiring towards? I do talk about spiritual things as well. I talk about other kind of, tried and true concepts in the space. Like I have this article called "The Death of the Trad Wife Ideal." Like how do we navigate the whole woman question element? Is so a lot of good stuff there. I do like to post a lot on X. A lot of the tweeting that I do is it's a mix of like positive, and kind of encouraging stuff, and then also just I'll share what I'm doing. I do live streams on Thursday nights, and then I do a X Spaces on Sundays. The Spaces, we encourage everyone, request the mic. They're more kind of free form conversations, a way to get people to connect. And, I think of it as kind of like digital therapy to some degree, of like getting to vent about things or ask questions and just make those connections. So a lot of different ways that I connect with people. I mean, this is kind of my full-time thing. I'm very focused on it. I do a lot of networking in the background. So if you're someone who's out there and listening and you're like, oh, I've been looking to get into this, like feel free to reach out and DM me. Like I'm usually pretty happy to jump on a call and have a conversation as well. So, but yeah, as far as, any kind of parting words, I think it's been a really fun conversation. It's always great to hear of kind of other people being on this wavelength. Like, it's one of those things where, if you're talking about like a really good band that you like, and someone's like, oh, I haven't heard that band, right? Like you could either react by being like diminishing them and making them feel bad about it, or you could be like, no, I'm super excited to like introduce you to this stuff, right? And I think that's kind of been my approach with the network, is like I keep running into people who I haven't necessarily heard of, but are on the right wavelength and are doing good stuff. And I'm like, I'm happy that there's more and more people that I don't know who I'm meeting, because if like I knew the limits of the network, that would be kind of demoralizing, right? Like I want there to be way more that I could explore. And so I think that kind of mindset and optimism of, there's a lot of people out there who think like us, who see the world like us. I mean, we don't have to agree on everything, and we might have our own kind of worlds and priorities and values and all that kind of stuff. But I would say that, it's largely invisible, but it is going on. And if you want to be part of that, taking the initiative, getting out, reaching out to people, being the person who would, if you couldn't find it locally, build it yourself. Right? Like if you build it, they will come. Like there's a reason that's such a prolific saying. And so I would just encourage people to be optimistic. I think things will get hard, but they will get better in the long term. And I think the most exciting thing for me in all of this is just all the great people that I get to interact with on a routine basis. Like these are the people who are living life and passionate and alive. And it's been an awesome experience, and I hope to meet many more people on this journey.
Amazing. Yeah. Great. Cheers for those final words. And thanks again for coming on. Until next time. Cheers, Meta.